They say the Alamo was a heroic last stand. A few brave Texans, outnumbered, outgunned, facing down the mighty Mexican army. But what if that wasn't the whole story? What if the men who died behind those walls weren't just heroes, but symbols of something far more complicated? Land, power, slavery, and rebellion. This isn't the story you've seen in movies. This is the real Alamo. And it begins long before a single shot was fired. Welcome to Echoes of History. Long before the first musket flared at the Alamo, the seeds of rebellion were already taking root in the soil of Texas. In the early 1820s, Mexico had just won its independence from Spain. The vast territory of Texas, what we now call Texas, was largely unsettled and vulnerable to raids and foreign encroachment. To secure the land, Mexico made a bold gamble. They invited Anglo-American settlers to come, live, and farm. They were promised land, freedom, and prosperity, on one condition. They had to become Mexican citizens, convert to Catholicism, and obey Mexican law. Among the earliest and most influential of these settlers was Stephen F. Austin, later known as the Father of Texas. He led hundreds of families, known as the Old 300, into the territory. But they brought more than just wagons and tools. Many brought slaves, even though Mexico, in the spirit of its revolution, was increasingly opposed to slavery. As the Anglo population in Texas swelled throughout the 1820s and early 1830s, so too did their resentment of Mexican authority. Settlers chafed under laws written in Spanish. They ignored Catholicism. They sidestepped tariffs and, crucially, clung tightly to their slaves, even as Mexico moved toward abolition. In 1830, alarmed by the growing number of Americans and the rebellious whispers spreading among them, the Mexican government, under President Anastasio Bustamante, attempted to halt immigration from the U.S. and reassert control. This only added fuel to the fire. By 1833, a charismatic and fiery general named Antonio López de Santa Anna rose to power in Mexico, proclaiming himself the defender of liberty and federalism. But once in office, he did the opposite, centralizing power and suspending the Constitution. Many in Mexico rebelled against him, but none with more determination than the settlers in Texas. In October 1835, tensions finally exploded into open conflict at the Battle of Gonzales. The Mexican military demanded the return of a small cannon lent to Texan colonists. The settlers refused, raising a banner that read, "Come and take it." Shots were fired. A revolution had begun. By December, the Texans had taken San Antonio. Spirits were high. Independence felt within reach. But deep in the heart of the city stood an old Spanish mission, the Alamo, abandoned, crumbling, but strategically placed. And soon, all eyes would turn to it. The Alamo wasn't supposed to be a battlefield. It had been the Franciscan mission, built in the 18th century, and long abandoned by its original purpose. But in the fog of war, symbolism often outgrows function. By early 1836, as word of Texas's rebellion reached Santa Anna, the Mexican President General was furious. To him, this was not a mere uprising. It was betrayal, treason fueled by foreign settlers who refused to assimilate. He vowed to crush the rebellion personally and with brutal efficiency. He assembled a force of nearly 6,000 soldiers, well-armed, seasoned, and loyal. They began a brutal march north from Mexico City in the dead of winter. Many perished along the way, but Santa Anna pushed forward, determined to make an example of Texas. Meanwhile, Inside San Antonio, a ragtag force of about 180 men took up position inside the Alamo. They were soldiers, frontiersmen, adventurers, many with no military background at all. Among them were 3 men whose names would echo through time. William B. Travis, the 26-year-old commander, stern, defiant, and uncompromising. James Bowie, the legendary knife fighter, bold but bedridden, dying slowly of tuberculosis. Davy Crockett, the former U.S. congressman and frontier icon, charismatic, funny, and fiercely loyal. These were not men expecting victory. They were men making a stand, some for glory, some for independence, some for the sheer principle of resistance. On February the 23rd, 1836, Santa Anna's army arrived outside San Antonio. Mexican troops surrounded the Alamo. A red flag was raised above their camp, a message as old as war. No quarter, no mercy. Inside the Alamo, Travis responded with a cannon blast. Over the next 12 days, the two sides exchanged intermittent fire. The Texans held strong, but they knew the odds. Travis wrote his now famous letter to the people of Texas and all Americans in the world, pleading for reinforcements. His words were fiery, dramatic, desperate. Only a few dozen would come, not nearly enough. Inside the fort, food and water dwindled. The cold crept in. Morale sank. But still, the defenders held on, refusing to surrender. They patched holes in the walls with mud and logs. They prepared for the storm they knew was coming. And on the morning of March 6, 1836, just before dawn, it came. The siege of the Alamo stretched into its 13th bitter day. Cold nights, little food, no reinforcements in sight. Yet not a single defender fled. Inside, William Travis paced like a man already dead. He wrote in his journal, spoke calmly to his men, and made peace with the idea that he might never leave the Alamo alive. His letters had gone out to the Texian government and militia leaders, but response was slow, scattered, and uncoordinated. James Bowie, once second in command, now lay dying in the barracks, his body consumed by illness. Too weak to fight, yet he refused to be evacuated. He ordered a pistol placed at his side. He would go down shooting. Then there was Davy Crockett, the man from Tennessee. He'd become a sort of morale officer among the men. His humor, his stories, and his unwavering calm kept the darkness at bay. But even Crockett knew the end was coming. Every night he stood on the walls with his long rifle, Old Betsy, peering into the blackness where Santa Anna's troops massed in silence. Outside the fort, the Mexican army tightened its grip. Trenches were dug closer each night. Cannons fired day after day, shaking the walls and ears of the defenders. Santa Anna refused to negotiate. His strategy was psychological. Break them slowly. Terrify them. Exhaust them. And yet, they held. The defenders were a mix of Anglo settlers and Tejanos, Mexican-born Texans, who believed just as fiercely in independence. Among them was Juan Seguin, who had left to gather reinforcements. Another was Gregorio Esparza, who chose to keep his family with him inside the fort, believing they'd be safer within its walls. His wife and children hid in the chapel, praying. The defenders made no speeches. They made no grand declarations. They loaded their muskets, mended their walls, and wrote letters to loved ones that would never be sent. Travis gathered the men. With death looming, he reportedly drew a line in the sand with his sword. Those willing to stay and fight, step across. All but one man crossed. This wasn't just a battle. It had become a testament, a last act of defiance against impossible odds. And in the early morning hours of March 6th, as the darkness thinned into a blood-red dawn, Santa Anna gave the signal. 4 columns of Mexican infantry surged forward, bayonets fixed, ladders raised. The Battle of the Alamo had begun. It was 5:30 a.m. on March 6, 1836. The chill of early dawn hung over San Antonio as drums rolled through the still air. Then trumpets pierced the silence. It was the signal. The Mexican army advanced in 4 columns, 1,800 men strong. Their orders clear. No quarter. Inside the Alamo, 180 weary defenders braced for their final stand, sleep-deprived, hungry, outgunned. The first wave hit the north wall. Volleys of musket fire erupted from the fort. Mexican soldiers fell in droves, but the defenders were too few. Soon, ladders were raised. The walls, weakened by 2 weeks of shelling, couldn't hold. The enemy poured over. William Travis, one of the first to die, was struck by a bullet to the head while firing his pistol. He fell near the north wall, his body later found with his sword by his side. At the southern palisade, Davy Crockett and a small group held firm. Swinging rifles like clubs, they fought hand to hand. Accounts vary. Some say Crockett died in battle. Others claim he was captured and executed shortly after. Either way, he did not surrender. James Bowie, too ill to rise from his cot, fought from his bed with pistols. He was bayoneted repeatedly, a savage end for a once proud warrior. The Mexican soldiers moved room to room, slaughtering all in their path. Within 90 minutes, it was over. Smoke filled the air. Blood soaked the earth. Of the defenders, none survived the assault. Only a few women, children, and slaves were spared, including Susanna Dickinson, widow of defender Almaron Dickinson. She and her infant daughter were brought before Santa Anna. He spared them and sent her out with a message. Tell the Texians what had happened here. It wasn't mercy, it was theater. Santa Anna wanted word of his brutality to spread. But the opposite happened. The Alamo, in death, had become a beacon. The names of Travis, Crockett, Bowie, etched into legend. And across Texas, something began to stir. The smoke hadn't cleared from the ruins of the Alamo when a storm began to gather across Texas. News of the massacre spread like wildfire, carried by survivors like Susanna Dickinson and Travis's slave Joe. Their harrowing accounts of Santa Anna's cruelty ignited rage in settlers and revolutionaries alike. But Texas wasn't ready. Sam Houston, commander of the Texian army, had refused to send reinforcements to the Alamo, knowing the odds were hopeless. He had a different plan. Bide time, build strength, strike smart. After the Alamo fell, Santa Anna grew overconfident. He divided his forces, believing the rebellion was crushed. It was a fatal mistake. As Santa Anna pushed east, Houston executed a scorched earth retreat. He ordered towns burned, crops destroyed, bridges dismantled. Thousands of civilians, men, women, and children, fled in terror. It became known as the Runaway Scrape. Chaos reigned. But Houston wasn't running. He was drawing the enemy in. Meanwhile, volunteers surged into the Texian ranks. Hardened by grief, driven by fury, they shouted a new battle cry. Remember the Alamo. By April, Houston had 900 men, raw and restless, but ready. Santa Anna, unaware of the true numbers and boiling with arrogance, encamped near the San Jacinto River with 1,300 troops. He didn't fortify. He didn't scout. He didn't believe the Texians would dare attack. He was wrong. On April 21, 1836, Houston launched a surprise assault. The Texians charged the Mexican camp shouting, Remember the Alamo. Remember Goliad. The battle lasted just 18 minutes. Hundreds of Mexican soldiers were killed. Others fled into the bayou. Santa Anna himself was captured the next day, disguised as a common soldier, hiding in the reeds. The price of the Alamo had been paid in blood. With Santa Anna captured and Texas victorious at San Jacinto, the Republic of Texas was born. Independence was secured, but the shadow of the Alamo would loom long after the smoke cleared. Santa Anna, held as a prisoner, was forced to sign the treaties of Velasco, agreeing to withdraw all Mexican troops and recognize Texas's independence. Though Mexico never formally acknowledged the new republic, the tide of history had turned. The United States would annex Texas in 1845, and soon after, the Mexican-American War would erupt, redrawing the map of North America. But the Alamo's most enduring legacy wasn't political. It was emotional, cultural, almost sacred. The fallen defenders, Travis, Crockett, Bowie, Bonham, became martyrs, their names etched into textbooks, monuments, and memory. The rallying cry, "Remember the Alamo," transcended time, used again in later wars as a symbol of defiance and honor. Yet, for all its reverence, the Alamo's story is complicated. Historians debate Davy Crockett's fate. Did he die heroically fighting or surrender only to be executed? Was James Bowie cut down in his sickbed or stabbed dozens of times as he fought with his famous knife? Were the defenders fighting for liberty or for the expansion of slave-holding territory? And then there's the role of Tejanos, Texans of Mexican descent, many of whom fought against Santa Anna but were later written out of the story. The Alamo became more than a battle. It became myth, shaped by storytellers, politicians, filmmakers, a sacred symbol for some, a distorted tale for others. But one truth remains. For 13 days in 1836, a group of outnumbered fighters stood their ground, knowing they would not survive, and hoping their sacrifice would ignite a revolution. And it did. They were not perfect men, but they became legends, and legends, like the walls of the Alamo itself, refused to fall.